This is my true story. I spent my life building a home, raising my son, and giving everything I had for my family. I believed my sacrifices would one day be honored. I believed love and respect would grow in my old age. But I never imagined my son would turn on me. One day, in cold words, he said, "You're not family anymore." Those words cut deeper than any wound. They burned in my heart. I chose a path no father wants to walk. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you are watching from now, and please subscribe so my story can reach more hearts. I spent decades building a home and a future for my son. I worked through storms, sickness, and tired days without complaint. I took extra jobs so he could have the things I never had. I missed meals and slept less to give him more comfort. I believed that every drop of sweat and every sacrifice would be returned with respect. I thought my son would honor me in my old age. Through years of hard work, I built not only a house, but a life filled with care. I believed a father's work is never done until his children stand strong. I thought I was planting seeds that would grow into respect and love. I did not know those seeds were withering. I remember days when I worked from dawn to dusk. My hands grew rough, my back bent, but I never complained. I wanted to give him stability. I wanted him to have opportunities I had never been given. I believed hard work would teach him gratitude. I believed sacrifice would create a bond stronger than blood alone. I used to wake before the sun and return when it had already gone down. I carried my burdens quietly. I thought my example would teach him responsibility. I believed that the sacrifices I made would speak louder than words. I believed in the promise of family, that children honor their parents without question. I thought my son would see my love in every tired step I took. There were days I wished for rest, but I could not stop. I worked not for myself, but for his future. I gave up small joys so he could have his dreams. I told myself patience would bring reward. I told myself respect comes with time. I never imagined that respect could disappear entirely. As years passed, I began to notice changes. I still worked, still cared, still gave without asking. But his voice toward me changed. His eyes no longer held warmth. His laughter no longer included me. I thought it was a phase, something that would pass with time. I thought love would heal what was breaking. I gave him my life, believing that love and sacrifice would build an unshakable bond. I thought my heart was safe in his hands. I thought my legacy was secure. I never guessed the day would come when those hands would push me away. I never guessed the day would come when my son would speak words meant to destroy me. For years, I kept going quietly. I never complained to friends or neighbors. I bore the burden alone. I thought my silence was strength. I thought my endurance was proof of my love. I believed that when the time came, he would recognize all I had done. I was wrong. The life I gave was not enough to keep respect alive. My work, my care, my sacrifices faded in his eyes. My years of giving were forgotten. My voice became weak in his world. The house I built for love became a place of cold silence. The father I was became invisible to him. I still remember the first time I felt the shift. It was a quiet evening. I returned from work, tired as always, with hopes of peace. But he greeted me with a glare and a sharp word. The warmth I expected was gone. I asked if something was wrong. He dismissed me. The seed of disrespect had begun to grow. From then on, each word between us grew sharper. The warmth of family faded. His voice became cold, filled with impatience. I noticed he stopped asking about my day. I noticed he stopped sharing his own. The silence between us grew heavier. I began to wonder if my sacrifices had been in vain. I asked myself where it had gone wrong. I searched my memory for the moment love turned to bitterness. I could not find it. I only knew the love I carried in my heart was no longer met with respect. I wondered if time could heal this wound. I feared it could not. Years of giving had not secured the bond I dreamed of. I gave my life to raise him, and yet I felt discarded. I began to understand that respect is not a guarantee. It is earned daily. I realized that even the deepest love can fade without mutual care. I began to fear what the future might hold. I thought of the family I had built. I thought of my own father and what he gave me. I thought of the chain of sacrifice that links one generation to the next. I believed I was strengthening that chain for my son, but he broke it with words. He broke it with disregard. I thought a father's legacy was measured in love, but I learned it is measured in respect. Without respect, love becomes silence. Without respect, sacrifice becomes pain. Without respect, even a lifetime of giving can be forgotten. I believed my son would stand by me when I grew old. I believed he would honor my years of labor. I believed my sacrifices would be remembered. But in that moment, I understood that nothing was certain. Respect could not be forced. It could not be commanded. It had to be given freely. That belief gave me clarity. I knew I could not change his heart with words. I knew I could not force respect through silence alone. I knew my only choice was to act. I had to make him understand the depth of his betrayal. I had to teach him the value of family and the cost of disregard. And so I decided I would no longer stand silent. I would no longer hide my pain. I would no longer let his cruelty pass without consequence. I would turn the years of sacrifice into proof. I would turn the absence of respect into action. I would write the final chapter of our story myself. I would make sure my legacy was not erased by bitterness. I would make sure my son knew what it meant to call a father not family anymore. I would show him that words have weight, but actions have power. Over time, the warmth between us began to fade. His words grew sharper, his tone colder. I noticed he no longer sought my company. I noticed he no longer listened to my advice. The boy who once ran to me for comfort now turned away without a word. The silence between us became heavy and hard to bear. Our conversations became rare and brief. When they happened, they were filled with impatience. He spoke to me not with respect, but with irritation. He began to question my choices, as if my life was his to judge. He dismissed the sacrifices I had made without a thought. The house I had built for love now felt like a battlefield. I remember the nights I lay awake wondering what had changed. I could not find a clear answer. I only knew that respect, once strong, was slipping away. I began to feel a cold distance growing between us. I began to sense that my role as a father was being replaced by something else. Resentment. I could not understand why. He stopped sharing his life with me. I was no longer a part of his world. I was no longer a confidant or a guide. I became invisible in the life I had built for him. I tried to speak to him gently, to reach him through love. But my words fell on deaf ears. My presence was no longer welcome. I noticed he began to speak of me in ways that stung. My efforts became jokes in his words. My sacrifices became complaints to him. The love I gave freely was returned with disdain. I wondered how a bond built on years of care could crumble so quickly. I wondered if I had failed as a father. The rift between us grew wider with every passing day. His arrogance replaced humility. His pride replaced gratitude. My quiet patience turned into quiet sorrow. I no longer knew my son as the boy who once clung to my side. I knew only a stranger who lived under my roof. I tried to understand his point of view. I searched for reasons in myself, in him, in the world. But I found no comfort. I only found growing hurt. I found my heart breaking in silence. I found myself losing the son I once knew. I feared I was losing the father I had been. The changes were subtle at first, but they became unmistakable. He no longer respected family traditions. He no longer valued the lessons I had taught him. He mocked the values I held dear. He spoke of me with contempt in front of others. My heart ached in ways I could not voice. I began to feel invisible in my own home. My voice no longer carried weight in his world. My opinions were dismissed. My presence was ignored. The love I gave was treated as weakness. The years of labor I gave to build his life were reduced to nothing. I kept quiet for a long time, believing silence might heal the wound. I believed patience could bring him back. But silence became a shield for cruelty. Patience became a way to endure pain. And I began to realize that the distance between us was growing too deep to bridge with words alone. Every day, I saw the change in him. I saw the pride in his eyes turn to arrogance. I saw respect give way to contempt. I saw the boy who once needed me transform into a man who did not care. I saw a son who no longer valued his father. I knew the rift was no longer something small, it was a chasm. The rift was not only in words, but in actions. He stopped acknowledging my presence. He stopped seeking my guidance. He began to act as if I was a burden. He avoided me at family gatherings. He dismissed my contributions quietly but cruelly. The father I had been was disappearing. I began to speak less, not out of peace, but because my words were ignored. I began to step back, not because I wanted to, but because I was forced to. I began to understand that my silence was no longer a choice. It was the only way to survive. I was no longer a father with a son. I was a man with a stranger under his roof. The distance between us grew until it became unbearable. I felt the weight of every unspoken word. I felt the ache of every dismissed effort. I felt the bitterness of years lost to misunderstanding. I knew I had to act before silence became my only reply. I knew the rift could not be mended with patience alone. I started to realize that this growing rift was not just about words or actions. It was about respect lost. It was about love turned cold. It was about a bond broken by cruelty and disregard. It was about a father who gave everything and a son who no longer cared to see. This growing rift became my turning point. I knew something had to change. I could not allow years of sacrifice to be erased by a single moment of disdain. I could not allow my life's work to vanish in silence. I knew I must take a step toward reclaiming my dignity. And so I decided that patience had ended. I decided that silence was no longer strength. I decided that the rift would not heal itself. I decided I would act, not with anger, but with truth. I decided I would show him the cost of losing respect. I decided I would turn his words into the lesson he could not ignore. That was the moment the rift became my purpose. That was the moment I stopped waiting for change and began making it. That was the moment I chose to stand before him, not in anger, but in resolution. That was the moment I prepared myself to turn betrayal into a lesson of life. That was my choice. That was my resolve. That was the moment my path changed. I was no longer only a father. I became a man determined to defend his dignity, no matter the cost. That decision would define the rest of my life. One afternoon, a disagreement began quietly, but grew into something fierce. The air in the house felt heavier that day, as if it already knew what was coming. My son's voice rose sharply, filled with anger and something I could not recognize. The words came suddenly, cutting through everything else. "You're not family anymore," he said, and the silence that followed was louder than those words. Those words struck deeper than any wound I had ever felt before. They were heavier than stone and sharper than any blade I had known in my years. They felt like the end of everything I had worked for in my life. Decades of sacrifice, nights without sleep, years of hard work, all reduced to a single sentence. I stood there, silent, unable to respond. My heart sank under the weight of his cruelty. I wondered how a son could say such words to his own father. I wondered if he even knew the meaning of what he had spoken. The words were not just insult. They were a declaration, a breaking of ties. They were a removal of all connection we once had. The words echoed in my mind long after they were spoken. They haunted me in my quiet moments. Every small sound reminded me of that day. They wounded my soul more than my body ever could. I felt as though every memory of our time together was erased. Every moment of care, every sacrifice I had made seemed to vanish into nothing. I felt the walls of my home closing in with shame. I felt a deep, aching loneliness that I could not shake. For hours, I sat alone in my room, replaying his voice in my head over and over again. The sharpness of his tone, the coldness of his expression, The finality of those words. They were like a verdict, a sentence handed down without trial. It was as if he had built a wall between us that could never be broken. The man who once called me father now declared me an outsider. It was not just disrespect. It was the end of the bond we had carried for decades. That moment became the turning point in our relationship. I realized words could hurt deeper than fists. I realized disrespect could wound for a lifetime. I realized that love without respect was empty. I realized I could no longer remain silent and pretend nothing had happened. I had to respond, but not in anger. I had to choose a way that would make him see the truth. I had to turn his cruelty into something that could never be undone. The cruelty of his words settled into my bones. It stayed there, deep and quiet, shaping my thoughts. I could still feel the sound of them echoing in my chest, as if they had been carved into my very spirit. I knew I could not undo what was said. I knew I could not erase the pain, but I could decide what came next. I could decide that silence was no longer my answer. I could decide to act, to make sure he understood the weight of what he had done. The moment was heavy with meaning. It was not just an insult. It was a declaration of war, though I would not fight with fists. My heart was broken, but my mind was clear. I would gather the truth quietly, without noise. I would prepare myself for the day when that cruelty would meet its justice. I would take his words and turn them into proof. I would stand before the law and show what his heart had done. I would make sure the world knew what those words truly meant and who truly carried the curse. I sat alone in my room after hearing those words. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock. The silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. My thoughts wandered through years of memory, of moments shared and sacrifices made. I thought of every time I had given without asking for anything in return. I thought of the nights I worked late while my son slept warm and safe. Each memory was a reminder of what I had lost. I remembered teaching him how to walk, how to speak, how to face the world. I remembered the times I stayed hungry so he could eat. I remembered the winters I endured without heat so he could have warm clothes. I remembered the dreams I gave up to make sure he could live his dreams. Each memory felt precious and broken now. The pain in my heart grew deeper than any bruise on my skin. I felt the weight of his words in every breath I took. "You're not family anymore," became a sentence I could not forget. I wondered how a son could erase years of love with a single sentence. I wondered if he even remembered the sacrifices I made. I wondered if he understood what family meant. The silence was no comfort, only a reminder of what was lost. For hours, I reflected quietly. I replayed moments when I should have spoken but stayed silent. I thought of the times I could have been stronger but chose patience. I realized patience was not always the answer. I realized that sometimes silence can give power to cruelty. I realized that I had to find a way to respond, not with anger, but with truth. I realized that my silence could no longer protect him from what he had done. I began to see a path forward. I understood that respect could not be demanded, but truth could be shown. I understood that my peace would not come from forgetting, but from action. I understood that my dignity depended on how I chose to respond. I knew I could not undo the cruelty, but I could change the ending. I could turn my pain into something that taught a lesson. I could make sure those words would not pass without consequence. In my quiet reflection, I made a decision. I decided to protect what was left of my dignity. I decided to make sure my life's work was not erased by his cruelty. I decided to act in a way that would be remembered not for bitterness, but for justice. I decided to keep a record, to gather proof of what had been done. I decided to stand quietly, but firmly, against the wrong that had been done to me. I decided to prepare for the day when silence would be broken. That night, I lay awake, thinking of what justice meant. I thought of the years of hard work, the giving of my life without complaint. I thought of the love I had poured out for my family. I thought of the hurt that had replaced gratitude. I thought of the cruelty that had come without warning. I thought of the moment I would stand and speak truth to power. I thought of the moment when my dignity would be restored, not with words, but with proof. When the morning came, I felt the weight of my choice resting on my shoulders. I had spent nights in silence, reflecting, weighing every possibility. Now the time for thought was over. The decision was clear. I could not go on pretending nothing had happened. I could not allow my dignity to fade into quiet suffering. I had to act, and I had to act with purpose. I gathered my courage slowly, piece by piece. The anger in my heart had cooled into resolve. I understood that this was no longer about punishment, but about truth. I wanted the truth to stand firm, so no one could question it. I wanted justice, not revenge in its bitter form, but a quiet justice that spoke louder than any words. I wanted to show my family that cruelty cannot live in silence. I began to collect evidence in the days that followed. Photographs of bruises, records of threats, and written notes of dates and events filled my drawer. I kept them hidden, away from curious eyes, but I knew their power. Each piece became a testament to years of suffering. Each photograph became a proof of the insult that still burned inside me. I knew they would be my voice when mine trembled. I spoke to my lawyer quietly. I explained my plan, my resolve to stand against cruelty, even when it came from my own son. He listened without interruption, offering advice and encouragement. Together, we made a plan that would ensure my evidence would be taken seriously, a plan that would allow the truth to stand before the law. I felt a strange relief, as though the burden of silence was finally lifting. The decision was not easy. I thought of the shame it might bring. I thought of how family would judge me. But I knew that silence was no longer an option. Silence would allow cruelty to grow. Silence would allow disrespect to flourish. I decided that my actions must speak louder than my pain. I decided that my dignity would be my voice. I decided that I would stand before the police and hand them the truth. I rehearsed it quietly in my mind. How I would enter the station, how I would hand over the evidence, how I would speak softly but clearly. I imagined the officers listening, the weight of the truth settling over them. I imagined my son being confronted not with my anger, but with the facts. I imagined the moment when his arrogance would falter, when the truth would strip away his pride. That night, I wrote down everything. Every insult, every blow, every moment I had endured in silence. I wrote it not with bitterness, but with clarity. I wrote it for myself, as a record of my journey. I wrote it for my family, so they would understand what had happened. I wrote it for the world, as proof that cruelty must be faced, not ignored. The words gave me strength. They shaped the decision into something final. The next morning, I stood quietly in my home, looking at the evidence I had collected. Each piece told a story, and each story had its own weight. I realized this was no longer just about my suffering. It was about showing respect to every person who had ever been silenced. It was about protecting the dignity of those who could not speak for themselves. It was about making sure cruelty could not hide in the shadow of silence. My heart felt steady now. I had moved past anger into a state of resolve. I knew that what I was about to do would change everything. I knew that my decision would be a turning point, not only for me, but for my family. I knew that my silence had ended, and truth was taking its place. I understood that this was the moment to stand firmly, not for revenge, but for justice. With that clarity, I stepped forward. My decision was no longer a thought. It was an action waiting to be taken. I had prepared myself for the moment, and I knew it would come soon. I knew the day would arrive when I would stand before the police and hand them his cruelty. I was ready. My silence had ended. My voice, strengthened by truth, was ready to be heard. The day I decided to act, the air felt heavy. My steps felt slower, weighed down by years of pain. But my heart felt lighter, as if the burden of silence had already been lifted. I dressed simply, in clothes that would not draw attention, because I wanted my actions to speak louder than my appearance. I carried with me the evidence I had collected, each piece wrapped carefully and placed in an envelope. I knew it was more than paper and photographs. It was my truth, my voice, my justice. As I approached the police station, my hands felt steady, though my chest beat faster. The door loomed ahead, not as a place of fear, but as a place of resolution. I thought of the nights I had spent hiding my bruises, swallowing my words, carrying my shame in silence. Those nights had led to this moment. I was walking into that station not as a victim, but as a man determined to stand against cruelty. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. I stepped inside quietly, my feet making soft sounds on the tiled floor. The station smelled of coffee and paper, of work and duty. I saw officers moving about, focused on their tasks, unaware of the storm I carried with me. My voice was steady as I approached the front desk. I asked for an officer in charge and was directed to a small office where someone would listen. I knew this was the moment to speak. Inside the office, I placed the envelope on the table with deliberate calm. I did not hurry. I looked at the officer, his eyes curious and attentive. I told him quietly, clearly, that what lay in that envelope was proof of years of cruelty. I spoke of bruises hidden in silence, of insults sharper than blades, of nights spent in fear. I told him that these words were not spoken lightly, that they carried the weight of truth and pain. The officer listened without interruption, taking notes. I spoke plainly, without drama or accusation, because truth needs no embellishment. I told him how my son had called me a curse, how he had broken my spirit through words and actions. I explained the evidence in my hands, photographs, medical reports, and written accounts. I told him that I was here not for revenge, but for justice. As I spoke, a strange calmness settled over me. It was as if each word lifted a piece of the burden I had carried for years. The envelope before him was more than paper. It was my voice, my dignity, my last stand. I realized that the act of speaking truth aloud was already a form of healing. I felt a quiet strength filling me, the strength that comes from knowing you have done what is right. When I finished, the officer nodded, folding the papers gently. He said little, but his silence carried understanding. He assured me that action would be taken, that the truth would not be ignored. I left the office with no fanfare, no applause, only a quiet certainty that my voice had been heard. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. My decision had been made. I had walked into that station not as a broken man, but as a man standing for justice. I stepped back into the daylight, the envelope safe in the hands of those who could act. My legs felt lighter, as if the truth itself was carrying me. I knew that walking into that police station had been more than a choice. It was a statement. It was a declaration that cruelty cannot hide forever, that silence is the enemy of truth, that dignity cannot be taken. It must be defended. I had defended mine. That day, I walked out not just as a father, but as a man who had chosen to turn pain into purpose. I knew my son would never understand the weight of my decision, but it did not matter. What mattered was that I had spoken, that I had acted. My silence was broken, and my truth had been given to those who could uphold it. In that moment, I knew my voice was stronger than his cruelty. The next hours felt slow, heavy with expectation. I stayed nearby the police station, quietly watching the officers prepare. I could hear faint voices behind the doors, but I kept my distance. My heart was full of both fear and relief. Fear because I knew what revealing the truth would mean, and relief because at last my silence was ending. The envelope I had handed them was no longer mine. It had become the voice of my years of suffering. I thought back to each bruise, each insult, each moment I had endured. I remembered the long nights spent wondering if anyone would believe me. Now, I knew they had the evidence. The photographs showed the marks hidden under clothing. The written notes told the story in plain language. Every scrap of proof was a piece of the truth I carried. They would now speak louder than any words my son could ever say to deny them. An officer came out to speak with me. He told me they would begin with a careful examination of my evidence. They would speak with witnesses, gather medical statements, and confront my son with what they had. I nodded quietly, not needing to ask questions. I had done what I could. What remained was in their hands. I felt a strange calm, a quiet surrender to justice. Minutes turned to hours as I waited. I sat in a small corner of the station, my hands folded on my lap. I thought of my son, of the years that had led to this moment. I thought of his words, "You're a curse on this family," and how those words had burned into my heart. I thought of the nights I had stayed silent to keep peace, and the moment I realized silence had been a shield for cruelty, not protection. Finally, I was called back. The officer led me to a room where my son was waiting. His face was pale, his shoulders tense. He looked at me with something between anger and confusion. I said nothing. I simply watched as the officers laid out my evidence on the table. They pointed to the photos, the written notes, the records of bruises and threats. They spoke calmly, clearly, so that no one could mistake the meaning. I saw my son's arrogance fade. His pride was replaced by silence, and then by a heavy, awkward shame. I watched as the truth I had carried for years stood before him like a mirror, reflecting all he had tried to hide. I could see the change in him, not in words, but in his posture, his gaze. The proof was undeniable. His cruelty was exposed for everyone to see. Neighbors and others gathered quietly outside the station. They whispered as they watched what was unfolding. Inside, there was no shouting, no spectacle, only the cold, clear presentation of facts. The truth was patient. It was steady. It was absolute. It did not need embellishment. It stood there, as solid as stone, against the lies that had been told for years. For the first time in decades, I felt free. Not because my son would change, he would not, but because I had given voice to my suffering. I had taken my pain out of the shadows. I had placed it in the hands of those who could act. The truth was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the world now. It belonged to justice. When the officers finally led my son away, I remained silent. My body felt light, but my heart was full. I knew this was the moment when the long chain of cruelty had been broken. My silence had been replaced by truth. My suffering had been replaced by justice, and my dignity had been restored. I walked out of the police station knowing that I had won, not in a battle of words, but in a battle of truth. The hours after I handed over my proof felt long and heavy. I sat quietly in the waiting area, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on me. My thoughts wandered back to all the moments that had led to this day. I remembered the years of silence, the nights I spent nursing my wounds alone, the days I wondered if anyone would ever believe me. Now, I knew the truth would be heard. When the officers finally called me back, there was a quiet firmness in their steps. They led me into a room where my son was waiting. His face was pale, his hands trembling. His eyes avoided mine, but I could see the flicker of fear and confusion. The room was tense. I stayed silent. There was no need to speak. The truth was already there, laid bare. The officers placed the evidence on the table in front of my son. Photos, written accounts, medical records, each piece a proof of the years of abuse and cruelty. They spoke slowly, clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. They explained that these were not just accusations, but facts supported by evidence. My son's posture changed. His arrogance began to fade, replaced by a look of disbelief. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak. He looked around for support, but there was none. The officers continued calmly, showing him the depth of what had been gathered. Every bruise, every insult, every moment of cruelty was accounted for. My silence had been broken, replaced by facts that could not be denied. I watched as my son's pride crumbled before my eyes. Outside the station, whispers began to spread. Neighbors gathered quietly, sensing something was unfolding. Inside, there was no shouting or fighting, only a slow, steady unveiling of truth. The officers did not rush. They allowed the evidence to speak for itself. My son, once proud and loud, now sat in silence. His defiance had been replaced by shame. The reality of what he had done was clear to everyone in that room. The moment was heavy with meaning. This was not just a legal confrontation, it was a reckoning. My son's years of cruelty, hidden behind closed doors, had been exposed in the light of truth. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, and without drama. But when it comes, it leaves no room for lies. I felt a deep sense of peace settle within me. When the officers placed the handcuffs on my son, I saw more than the fall of a man. I saw the breaking of a cycle. I saw the moment when years of abuse were ended, not with violence, but with truth. The silence in the room was heavy. My dignity had returned, not because I fought with my fists, but because I had given voice to my pain. Justice had arrived. Neighbors who had gathered outside now stood in silence. They knew what they had witnessed was not just an arrest, but the consequence of years of hidden cruelty. Respect returned to me quietly, without words. My son's fall was not loud or boastful, but deliberate and clear. The truth had spoken, and it had spoken loudly enough to change everything. For me, this was the moment of justice. After the police took my son away, the house felt different. There was a silence I had not known for years. No shouting, no insults, no slamming doors. The air felt lighter, even though my heart was still heavy. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching things that once held memories of better times before the cruelty began. Every corner seemed to tell a story of loss and betrayal, but also of survival. Neighbors began to speak quietly among themselves. Some came to offer support, others just watched from afar. The truth of what had happened was now known. No one could ignore it. The whispers that had been behind closed doors were now spoken openly. My courage to speak out gave others courage too. I realized my silence had not protected anyone. My voice had broken a cycle of harm. Family members who once turned away now reached out. They came with hesitant words, looking for understanding. I spoke little, for I knew my actions had spoken louder than anything I could say. They nodded quietly, offering small gestures of respect. The past could not be undone, but the present had shifted. The balance had changed. My home felt safer now, though the wounds remained. I spent long nights reflecting. My son's absence was a wound in itself, but the peace it brought was undeniable. I had traded years of silent suffering for a single act of truth. Justice, I realized, was not revenge, but clarity. The law had done its part, but my own peace had come from stepping forward. It was a lesson I wished I had learned sooner. With each passing day, the sense of relief grew. I no longer feared speaking my truth. I no longer hid bruises or swallowed pain. My voice became a shield, my courage a weapon against cruelty. My neighbors began to treat me with respect again. They no longer saw me as a victim, but as a man who had stood for himself. Respect is not given, I realized. It is earned. My son's name became a quiet example in the community. People spoke of what had happened not with gossip, but with awareness. Abuse, they said, can hide behind silence. And silence, they agreed, allows cruelty to grow. My choice to speak had changed not only my life, but theirs too. The truth I had gathered was now part of a larger lesson for all who had heard it. In those quiet days that followed, I found a strange peace. My house was calm, but my heart was not free of sorrow. I mourned the loss of the son I once believed in. Yet I knew I had acted with dignity. I had chosen truth over fear, justice over silence. The aftermath was not just about punishment, it was about restoration. For me, this was the true meaning of justice. Now, as an old man, I tell this story with a calm voice, not bitterness. My body carries scars, and my heart carries memories. Yet my spirit feels stronger than ever. I have lived long enough to see that life is not about how much you endure, but how you respond to what life gives you. My son took my patience for granted, my sacrifices for granted, and my love for granted. But I learned that my own dignity must be guarded above all else. I look back and see clearly that respect is not automatic. It is built with actions, proven with time, and kept with truth. My son lost his way when arrogance took root. He forgot that family is not just blood. It is care, trust, and respect. I stayed silent too long, hoping he would remember. But silence became my prison. Speaking out was my release. That truth gave me my power back. In the years after that night, I found peace in small things. The quiet in my home was a gift I had not expected. The smiles from neighbors who once looked away became my reward. I realized that respect returns in many forms, not always loud, not always obvious. Sometimes it comes as quiet nods, understanding looks, or a simple word of thanks. I had traded my silence for a lesson that could not be erased. The hardest part was losing him. My son's absence is a wound that never heals. I grieve not just for what happened, but for the man he might have been. I remember the boy who once clung to my hand and trusted my words. Somewhere along the road, that trust broke, replaced by cruelty. Yet even in that loss, I found clarity. I could not change his heart, but I could choose how I ended my part of the story. My choice was not born of anger, but of truth. I chose to stand before the police, not to humiliate, but to expose, to show that cruelty cannot survive in the light. I had proof, and I gave it without bitterness. That moment was my reclaiming. My son called me a curse, but I stood before the law and handed them his cruelty. That day, I reclaimed my dignity. I learned that truth is stronger than any insult. I reflect often on what justice means. Justice is not revenge. Justice is restoration. It is not punishment for its own sake, but a way to restore balance. That balance is fragile. It can be broken by silence, by neglect, by ignoring the wounds beneath the surface. I broke my silence so that others would not suffer in silence as I had. My act became a lesson for others and for myself. Now, I tell my story so it is remembered, not for glory, but for warning. I tell it so that others may find courage. Courage to speak, courage to stand, courage to protect their own dignity. I have learned that silence protects the guilty, but truth destroys cruelty. That is the lesson of my life. My son once told me, "You're a curse on this family." I tell you now with a calm heart, the real curse was his cruelty. And I showed the world. The years have taught me patience, but also the power of action. Time heals wounds, but truth heals deeper. My journey taught me that dignity is not given. It is taken, preserved, and defended. I have chosen to preserve mine. My life is my own proof. My actions stand as evidence that even in betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, there is strength in truth. That strength cannot be taken away. I close my eyes and see my life as a long road with many trials. The hardest trials are those of the heart. To forgive without forgetting is a choice. To speak without fear is courage. To live without bitterness is wisdom. I stand here now as an old man who has chosen all three. My story is my gift to the world. It is not the story of a curse, but of reclaiming honor in the face of betrayal. Final thought. He said I was a curse. I stood before the police and handed them his cruelty. In doing so, I freed myself. That was my last lesson as a father, as a man, as an old man. And that is the truth I leave behind.